Hey there, and welcome to your video on topic 7.1, an introduction to air pollution. Before you get started with all of these, because we are now learning from home, it's going to be really key for you to basically begin with the end in mind, and here's what I mean. In your files, I have uploaded the course and exam description, which is this stuff right here, but then I've also uploaded the specific document that you're looking at, which is in general the pages that match up with the topic. You're going to notice in the questions that I gave you, if I've expanded beyond this, so do stick with the pages that I gave you. You can see as an example here that I've expanded this particular section to include these pages, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But this is a really nice, more concise reference in terms of the topic, the enduring understandings, and the essential knowledge. So definitely reference these, and I will reference those as well before each topic. So in this one, Introduction to Air Pollution, you can see human activities have physical, chemical, and biological consequences for the atmosphere. Identify the sources and effects for pollution. And then you can see it says, here, let me make it a little bit bigger, sorry about that. Coal combustion releases air pollutants including carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, toxic metals, and particulates. When you read a statement like that, you should immediately be saying to yourself, okay, these are chemical names, but what are the formulas? So carbon dioxide, CO2 is an example, sulfur dioxide is SO2. Toxic metals, what do they mean by that? We'll find out as we do the topic. And then particulates, and you'll find out what that is as well. Then you should also be thinking to yourself, okay, so this is specifically from coal. So I know if there's a question on the national exam that says identify air pollutants that are released through the combustion of coal, it's all right here for you. So I am not going to read the rest of these because that's kind of taking up valuable video time. You can either pause the video right now and look at these yourself, or you can pull up these documents and look at them first. Part of why I'm doing this is I'm trying to teach you good study habits for when you do get to college. Because there's not going to be anybody there holding your hand and leading you through this process. In order to get the most from your reading, and you will need to do a lot of reading, you need to understand what it is the professor wants for you to learn. And our professor is ultimately College Board when they give you the national exam, and they're literally telling you what you need to know right here. My job is to interpret the specificity of this and then link it to our textbook and then provide context. But really, in essence, this is what you have to know. And then also realize this isn't just facts. You need to understand context for this as well. And so that's, like here, air quality can be affected. Exactly what does that mean? I will explain that to you. What does this word dramatic mean? Again, I'll explain that to you. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with this. So you can see I've got a whole list of questions here for you, and I want you to start in pages 545 to 546. This is the story of lead in the drinking water of Flint, Michigan. And while this is more water pollution than it is air pollution, it does reference the deleterious effects of lead on human health, which is something that can happen when you inhale lead particles as well as when you ingest them as ions in tap water. This is also a topical thing for you to really understand what's going on. So in 2014 in Flint, basically, which is a city with the majority of the people who live there are people of color, and the majority are very poor. So what does that mean? It means that they are largely disenfranchised from the political process, meaning that a lot of decisions are made without their input. So to save money, they switched over to a source of water that ended up, unbeknownst to the people who made the switch, being corrosive to the protective coating along the lead pipes, which the poorer folks in town had. Not a problem for folks in richer areas of town because they had replaced the pipes a long time ago. So anyway, so basically here's what happened. That water ate away at the protective coating, which in turn released, and all of this that I'm saying right here is explained right here in this verbiage in the notes that you have, which in turn released the lead particles, which is a neurotoxin. That word means, neuro means your nervous system, particularly your brain, and then toxin means not good. Side note, please don't use the word toxic on the exam unless you follow it up with a specific example, because the word toxic, everything is toxic. Water can be toxic to you if you drink too much. There's something called the dose makes the poison, and so it's very important for you to talk about the levels that make something toxic and then the specific effects. So back to the lead. In this case, the folks there were drinking water with lead in it. You can't taste it because it's lead ions. And it was being stored in the fattiest parts of their tissue, which is, for people, your brain. For adults, that is problematic because that can lead to decreased levels of being able to process stuff mentally. Although that kind of thing takes years. I don't know if this is the case with lead. I do know, at least with mercury, if you do, even as an adult, have high levels of mercury in your system, you do have what's called heavy metal induced schizophrenia. I'm not sure that that's the case with lead. Again, little tangent. The reason that the Hatter in Alice in Wonderland was mad or crazy is because he made hats. And back in the day, one of the chemicals that was used to treat hats included something called methylmercury. It is a form of mercury that when you inhale it, it again builds up in your brain over time. Remember, again, this is not all forms, it is a specific ion. And it causes heavy metal induced schizophrenia. So his profession made him crazy. And once you have it in your brain, you can't get rid of it. It's stored there kind of permanently. Well, what is the population that usually suffers the most from any sort of toxin like this? It's usually three: the elderly, the immunocompromised, and children. And by children, I also mean including fetuses. In this case, the group that is severely harmed by heavy metal poisoning are children, including fetuses. So that means when this stuff builds up in their developing brains, it causes permanent learning disabilities. Like, you're done. Even if you could magically take away the lead, the disability remains. So, there is no safe, acceptable level for lead in your system. So any measurable level of lead, even any exposure to lead, is considered to be toxic. So do make sure if you refer to lead as being toxic that you say it is toxic, because any level whatsoever of lead that is in the human system is problematic to that system. And you can see right here, there are 9,000 children under the age of 6. And when you look at the levels, it's ridiculous what the levels of lead were. Now, the fun part was, what is not in here, and I want to encourage you to find this out on your own, is the whistleblower here who found out about this was a local pediatrician. And she brought it up to the community members there, the city council, and they basically blew her off and more made her sound like she was overreactionary and hysterical, being a female doctor. Turns out she was absolutely 100% correct, and it also turns out that the city commission, while they blew her off, and because changing the water supply back would have been expensive, they also quietly switched their water source in the county office to bottled water. So I do believe multiple of those people were finally arrested. Do realize that this is an ongoing natural disaster because the pipes have yet to be replaced. And remember, even if you change the water supply, that coating is gone. So this is still an ongoing disaster in the United States. The other reason I bring this up is we always like to think about these things happening in third world countries. This is Michigan. And this is going on in real time. All right, so again, the reason I bring this up is because lead is one of the things that we're going to be talking about in terms of our air pollution unit. So you've got a pretty good idea of why it is a problem. All right, so I even said that here. Note that air pollution, like all pollution, depends upon concentration. Anything become lethal if concentrated enough, the dose makes the poison. Also note that different substances become lethal at different concentrations, and that lethal concentrations can be immediately harmful, which means acute. This is like somebody who has, this is like rattlesnake poison or venom. You get bit, you get the venom in your system, it's going to cause a reaction right away. And then there are some things that reach those lethal levels over time, things like lead and mercury. It's biomagnification, or bioaccumulation. Your small, tiny inputs of this toxin are not toxic, but because usually they're stored in fatty tissues, you're eventually going to get to that threshold that does make it problematic for your system. And then some pollutants break down quickly in the environment to non toxic components while others remain unchanged. They are what is called persistent. Um, a lot of the pollutants that we talk about in air pollution they're persistent. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about this one. Define primary and secondary pollutants and recognize examples of each. So we're going to turn to page 602. So right here. Again, I can't hold you accountable for this really because everything I'm doing is online, and so therefore you can crowdsource whatever you want. That exam is coming. So you are going to have an opportunity to get the grade that you want in class, but you have to hold yourself accountable here. And part of the way that you're going to have to do that is to put in the time. You can't have a toned body by running for 20 minutes once a week. You have to put in the time to get what you want. And I will tell you that, especially in our current situation, the colleges will notice if you have an A for the semester, but you pull a 1 on the national exam. Not to say that a 1 is bad, but that imbalance there is going to be pretty indicative of perhaps your lack of engagement in this material. So I do want to encourage you to actually look at the course and exam description, see what you need to learn, do the reading, then visit the questions, and then listen to this video if you need it. All right, so I'm done momming out on you. Let's go ahead and move on here. So this is just talking about in general where you can get air pollution from. The classification of primary versus secondary is right here. Primary pollutants. Hold on a second, let me make a note to myself. I think I forgot to put something in a PowerPoint. Okay, so primary pollutants are those that are emitted directly into the air. You burn something, you create carbon dioxide. You burn coal and it has mercury impurities in it. It releases the mercury as a gas. You use sulfur impurities, it's sulfur dioxide. It's what's released directly in the air. Secondary pollutants are when a primary pollutant mixes with something in the air, usually water, and forms a new harmful chemical. This is where something like acid rain comes from. So how does urban pollution affect rural locations? It's really simple. It's something called wind. And I don't have, I guess we'll go ahead and use this. If you have a factory that produces air pollution, a lot of times those smokestacks are very high, pushing that pollution up into the jet stream. It gets caught and then it will come down in rural areas. Why is this problematic? Because rural areas are also places where we like to grow our food. So yeah, that's kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. All right, so for the following pollutants, know the following details. Chemical name, chemical formula, where it comes from, if it can form a secondary pollutant and what that pollutant is. Parentheses there for no reason, sorry about that. If it is a primary or a secondary pollutant, its appearance and odor, its effect on human health, and human-made structures, its effect on the environment, and any other detail of note. So basically what I am telling you is you need to know everything in the next 2.5 pages. So as you can see right here, you have carbon monoxide and you have carbon dioxide. Definitely know the difference. Now remember, anything that you inhale that is not oxygen is not great for you. The higher in concentration it gets. The issue is this is just dead space in your lungs. This will bind with your hemoglobin and make it difficult for your blood to uptake oxygen. This, while it's not good for you, is unlike this, which can become toxic if it builds up in your system. So definitely know those. Read all about this here. Definitely know if something is odorless. That's kind of important because it means that it is tough to detect. And remember also when you're talking about stuff like carbon monoxide, if a family gets poisoned by carbon monoxide, remember that it's the pets and the children that are going to die first because they are smaller. It takes less of an amount in their bodies to reach the concentration that will make it toxic for them, which will kill them. As an example, if you have a cup of water and a gallon of water, and you pour the same amount of food coloring into both, you're going to notice that the ultimate color is different in each one. Because again, dose is mostly the concentration of that toxic thing within a system. So it's not that they have underdeveloped lungs. Kids' lungs are fine. They run around all day long. It's the fact that there's less of them. So the same amount per unit volume, that's where the difference is right there. Okay, so nitric oxide and nitric dioxide, realize that these things cycle back and forth so much that we group them together into something called NOx. There's also something called nitrous oxide, N2O, which, while it's separate here, is oftentimes lumped in. That's kind of a... When you say NOx, I highly recommend that you go with NO and NO2. And if you want to talk about nitrous oxide, which is specific from fertilizers, refer to N2O for sure. Then it talks about some of the secondary pollutants that can form. Definitely, hey guys, air pollution mostly affects the the respiratory system of humans, with the exception of something like a heavy metal that enters the bloodstream and is stored in fatty tissues, and also with the exception of something like carbon monoxide, which affects hemoglobin. So if you have to guess, go with aggravates the respiratory system, which also means that people with pre-existing conditions like asthma and COPD and lung cancer are going to be even more affected by this because their lung function is already compromised. Sulfur dioxide, SO2, is a primary, sulfuric acid is secondary, and then particulates is dust. You need to pay attention to these numbers here. Bigger than PM, I want to say not 2.5, but 25 means it's big enough for your nose hairs to pick up. PM10 means it can get into your lungs. PM 2.5, it means it can definitely get in there and just clog stuff up. It fills your little alveoli, and then less room for oxygen, which is, bad. And then you have ozone. We've talked about a little bit about ozone before. We haven't gotten to the ozone layer. Specifically, remember that ozone is good up high and bad nearby. When it is in the stratosphere where it's supposed to be naturally, it protects us from UV rays that give us skin cancer. When it is formed via human event or human actions in the troposphere, that is where it is a problem. For everything from humans' respiratory systems to it decreases the primary productivity of plants. So you're also going to notice it talks about climate change in here. I'm going to touch on that oh so briefly when we're done with this unit. So just understand, just file in your head that it is a greenhouse gas, and that increases in greenhouse gases lead to climate change. How that happens, we'll talk about as a coda right before the national exam. All right, volatile organic compounds. They're called VOX for short. This is basically anything, if it has an odor, everything from perfume to gasoline is a volatile organic compound. Think about what that means. Volatile means it forms a vapor. Organic doesn't mean good for you. It means it contains a carbon, and then compound is a compound. So, as an example, eucalyptus trees produce VOX. So basically, if you can smell it, it's probably a volatile organic compound. So yeah, read all of that stuff. And then there's a whole thing on lead in here again. You're going to notice that, does this word talks about it? Hold on a second, kiddos, let me see. All right, this here is a key, how do you say, component to this passage. And here's why. back in the day, which is when I was a kid, gasoline contained lead. Why? Because lead helps to engines run more smoothly for reasons you don't need to understand. Well, turns out that a lot of that lead, well, pretty much all of it, goes out the exhaust. And it was becoming detectable in kids' blood levels. So in the 70s is when we started phasing out leaded gasoline, and it was all gone by 1986. And we have definitely lowered the levels of that. Lead used to be a big component in paint because lead makes colors brighter. It also used to be in makeup back in the day. Like an Elizabethan era when all the ladies like their faces white. Yeah. So, but that was also banned in the US. Keep in mind, side note, that there is still lead in paint in old houses that were built before the 50s. So that is where, because kids like to put everything in their mouths, kids can still get lead poisoning from eating paint and breathing in the dust as they peel it off the walls. Also, a lot of other countries have not banned lead from paint, which is why I always recommend that you don't buy toys from other countries, especially those that are brightly colored and made of something solid like wood or metal, because kids will put it in their mouth and there's a good chance that that paint contains lead. Also notice another source is soil contaminated by old gasoline that's there, and then also from pipes. Big lesson here is that there is no such thing as a way. So if something used to be used, it's stored somewhere in the soil or water. Okay, so anyway, that's on you to write all that stuff down. All right, next question. Why did lead levels drop in 1976? I already talked about that. It's because we banned lead from being in paint, and we banned lead from being in gasoline. Let's see. How do you think leaded gasoline contributed to evolution? Well, obviously they breathed in the fumes. How can people, especially children, still become poisoned by lead in the U.S.? I already went over that. You can eat paint chips. You can breathe in dust from paint particles that are around or on toys, and then also it's in the soil, and then also leads. These are things that little kids aren't going to come into contact with, but it's these. It's old paint still on walls, soil contaminated with lead emitted by motor vehicles, and then those lead pipes that still exist. Useless fact for you: the symbol for lead on the periodic table is Pb because the Roman word for lead is plumbus, which is where plumber comes from, because all pipes used to be made of lead. All right, what system in the human body is most affected by air pollution? Again, it is your upper respiratory system. So that's a no-brainer. Let's see if I can find the picture with the lungs on it. It's not in here. It's definitely going to be something in these associated videos. Here we go. So page 616, by the way, is hello, these are your lungs. And this explains that if the especially particulate matter, if it can get beyond these cilia, it can clog these up. And then gaseous chemicals that come in here can make these inflamed, which means they fill with fluid, which also renders them useless. Let's see. How does air pollution affect the system? Kind of already talked about that like a lot. Let me show you specifically where to find it in your book. It's kind of all scattered through here, so just make sure that you've read all of this. And then what are the outcomes of prolonged exposure to air pollution on the human body? This is right. Oh, here we go, 615 to 618. It would help if I actually turned the pages. Sorry, guys. No wonder I wanted to find that page, is because it's literally supposed to be finding it here. So this all explains it. This is all on page 615. da, 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 da. This is really key. It's not just that your lungs become irritated, is that you can end up getting lung cancer. It can actually cause asthma, heart attacks, and strokes. So living in an area with high air levels of air pollution can lead to heart attacks and strokes later on in life. It's not just that you have irritated lungs the whole time. It's can be fatal. Although it's not a part of your studies, there were examples of in London, there was an industrial created fog that stayed over London for a couple of days, and many people died from that. There was a disaster in Donora, Pennsylvania. Same thing, where thousands of people were sickened and some died because a cloud of air pollution stayed over the town for a couple of days. Okay, so anyway, this kind of outlines that for you. Please, on the exam, do not use words like everyone dies and tons of people. Be very conservative in what it is that you're saying. And because this is an open note exam now, you will have the ability to kind of have some specifics in front of you to rein it in a little bit. All right, so let's see. What is the EPA? That is the Environmental Protection Agency. It was founded in the early 70s, and it was intended to be the body that makes sure that environmentally related laws are executed. While I don't want to get political, please do realize that our current administration is in the process of kind of reducing the scope of these laws and thus also reducing the reach that the EPA has in terms of protecting our environment. Being conservators of the resources that we have, I guess would be a better way of putting it. Which country passed the Clean Air Act of 1970? That's us. The Clean Air Act is one of 10 laws that you're supposed to know for the national exam. So definitely make a note of it. Do you need to know times? Not really. Although you're going to notice we keep talking about 1970. That is exactly when the quote-unquote environmental movement really started. Why was this law passed in the first place? Because people were kind of sick of breathing in air that made them cough all the time. Why do I like bringing this up? Because a lot of times things seem hopeless. Some of the biggest changes that we've made in this country have been from the bottom up. You just have to want it and want to be willing to fight for it and be able to assemble yourself in large enough numbers to make that change happen. So change is well within your grasp. All right, so anyway, why was the law passed in the first place? I already brought that up. I will also point out that the president that was in office right here was Richard Nixon, a Republican. There was a time when being a good steward of our environmental resources was considered to be a bipartisan effort. So please keep that in mind as you move forward in your life. And then what are the 6 major outdoor air pollutants covered by the Clean Air Act? In other words, these are the 6 major ones that if a certain region does not have these within the stated limits, things like fines and jail time result, provided that you can find the person or people who are responsible for this. Carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, suspended particulate matter, which means the little dudes, ozone, and lead. While I don't ask it here, we're going to talk about it a little bit later. It is important to know where all of this stuff comes from. If you remember, carbon monoxide comes from the partial combustion of something that contains carbon. So that's everything from gasoline to coal. Nitrogen dioxide is, while it can be emitted from coal-fired power plants, it is largely emitted by cars. Here in the United States, we've put in a safeguard for that. We'll talk about it in a little bit. Sulfur dioxide, sulfur is largely a impurity in coal. So that happens when you burn coal. Suspended particulate matter, that can be anything with carbon. Ozone is a secondary pollutant, and we'll learn about how that's formed in future topics. And then lead is, again, it used to be an additive in gas, and by taking it out of gas and paint, we've pretty much gotten rid of that source. Okay, so that is all the questions there, so happy reading.